Military Log Entry 04, 27 hours, March 17, 1944, Northern Burma, outskirts of Myitkyina Airfield, temperature 78 degrees F, humidity 89%. The jungle breathed with a kind of damp, uneasy silence, the kind that came only after the roar of engines and the final clatter of spent shell casings stopped echoing through the trees, and the acrid scent of burned fuel still clung to the morning air like a ghost of the battle that had ended just hours before. In that haze of smoke and half-light, Japanese engineers moved carefully through the twisted wreckage of what once had been an American armored spearhead. A column of M4 Sherman tanks ambushed and annihilated near the river crossing. The ground was still soft with blood and oil, the two fluids indistinguishable in the shadows, and above it all, the voice of the narrator cut through, calm but weighted with the gravity of memory. In the spring of 1944, deep within the jungles of northern Burma, Imperial Japanese Army engineers made a discovery that would alter their perception of American war technology, and perhaps, for a brief moment, their faith in their own invincibility. Around the wreck of the Sherman designated Able 6, the engineers gathered with tools, flashlights, and clipboards marked in neat kanji. Their commander, a seasoned technical officer named Captain Ishida, standing apart, quietly studying the tank's hull where the insignia of a white star had been nearly erased by fire. His expression was one of restrained curiosity, but beneath that was a flicker of unease. "It is said," the voice continued, "that soldiers of the 18th Engineer Regiment were ordered to dismantle the captured machine and send a technical report to Tokyo. They expected crude American craftsmanship, a mass-produced iron beast built for numbers rather than finesse. What they found instead stopped them cold. But before that discovery would come, there was another story, a smaller one, a human one, that would lead to this moment. A young Japanese infantryman, Private Kenji Morita, had broken protocol only a day earlier. He had run into the jungle under fire to pull his wounded comrade out from under a burning Hago light tank, ignoring direct orders to fall back. The act had cost him half his squad and nearly his own life. It was in that chaos that he saw for the first time the Sherman, a hulking shape cutting through smoke, its turret turning with mechanical precision, its gun spitting flame in slow, deliberate rhythm. Witnesses recalled, the narration continued, that Morita described the enemy tank not as a machine, but as something alive, something that moved with purpose. The next morning, after the ambush that left the American column destroyed, Morita stood silently as engineers examined the wreckage, his hands trembling not from fear, but from something close to awe. The documentary tone hardened, layering the facts with quiet inevitability. This Sherman was captured intact, its crew killed by a single armor-piercing round through the rear engine plate. To the Japanese command, it was an invaluable prize. To those who would study it, it was a mirror showing them what they were up against. The camera would linger in imagination on the details, the dents on the glacis plate, the melted rubber of the tracks, the faint smell of gasoline mixed with burned flesh. Engineers recorded everything. Thickness of armor measured with calipers, transmission layout sketched on worn notepads, suspension components removed with practiced care. Technically speaking, the narrator explained, the Japanese expected simplicity. Instead, they encountered a marvel of industrial efficiency. The Sherman's radial engine, though damaged, represented a feat of compact power distribution. Its gyrostabilizer, a device unknown to most Japanese tank crews, allowed it to fire with shocking accuracy, even on the move. As wrenches clinked against steel, Captain Ishida's face darkened. "How did they build so many of these?" he muttered, almost to himself. The narrator's voice carried that thought forward. Japan's war industry could not match the scale of American production. Each tank here was a world unto itself, a handmade effort compared to the factory-born Shermans that rolled from Detroit's lines by the thousands. The engineers began disassembling the turret, noting the precision of its gears, the smooth rotation of its ring, the quality of its cast armor. Every piece told a story of mechanized discipline. But then, as they reached deeper, removing the transmission casing and accessing the electrical wiring, they froze. There, the narration dropped to a low, tense whisper. They found something that no one expected, an integrated communication network wired directly into the vehicle's intercom and radio relay. The Sherman was not alone. It was part of a system, a network of machines capable of coordinated fire and movement. Ishida ordered silence. The only sounds were the drip of condensation from the jungle canopy and the faint buzz of insects circling the open hatches. To men who had lived and fought in isolation, each tank acting independently, this revelation was devastating. It meant that their enemy did not fight as individuals, but as a single, thinking organism. The voiceover continued. And yet, what unsettled them most was not mechanical, but human. The inside of the Sherman told a story. Notes scrawled on the turret wall, maintenance logs, jokes, names of wives and girlfriends back home. A photograph burned at the edges but still visible, an American crew smiling beside their tank before deployment. These men, now dead, had left ghosts within the machine. Captain Ishida reached for the photograph, hesitated, and then carefully folded it, slipping it into his uniform pocket. For a brief moment, the narration said, the war ceased to be about nations or even victory. It became a confrontation between two forms of humanity, one drowning in the weight of industrial power, the other clinging to the last fragments of spirit. Outside, the air thickened with the approach of rain. Thunder rolled over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, a lone American reconnaissance plane droned overhead. The engineers worked faster, cataloging, measuring, sketching. They discovered, too, that the Sherman's armor had been treated with a new process, face-hardened casting reinforced with high-grade manganese steel. In Japanese tanks, armor of such quality was unthinkable. A lieutenant cursed under his breath. "It's like dissecting a god," he said, and the others did not laugh. They were men trained to believe in the superiority of their own empire, the narrator continued. But that day, surrounded by the mechanical evidence of a world beyond their reach, they felt the cold shadow of inevitability. As the day dragged into night, the dismantled Sherman lay like a great carcass under floodlights powered by a portable generator. Its turret rested beside its hull, its engine stripped bare. By 200 hours, the voice recounted, Captain Ishida filed his report. His handwriting, though disciplined, betrayed hesitation. He described the Sherman as a vehicle designed not for heroism but for endurance. He noted that its production methods were beyond replication in Japan's current capacity, and he ended with a single line. If this is what they build, then our war has already ended, only time refuses to admit it. The scene would fade now to archival photographs, the narrator's tone deepening. Few records of that report survive. It was intercepted by U.S. intelligence after the war, among thousands of documents retrieved from the ruins of Tokyo. But it stands as a moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that the tide of war had shifted irrevocably. The rain began to fall, soaking the engineers, washing away soot and ash, beating against the steel remains of the tank. Private Morita stood in the downpour, his eyes fixed on the gutted Sherman. He did not see an enemy machine anymore. He saw something closer to a prophecy. And in that jungle, the narration concluded for this moment, as lightning flashed across the canopy and thunder rolled through the valley, men who had been taught to never doubt the divine mission of the empire found themselves staring into the truth of a future they could no longer deny. That night the rain did not stop. It fell in sheets that turned the camp into a mire of mud and flickering lantern light, the kind of tropical storm that devoured sound and time alike. Yet within that storm, the engineers continued their work, driven less by orders and more by the silent compulsion to understand what they had uncovered. Records suggest, the narrator's voice intoned through the hiss of imagined static, that by dawn of March 18th, the disassembly of the captured Sherman had reached its most critical stage, the examination of its fire control systems, its transmission, and the mysterious electrical circuits that connected turret movement to the gunner's optics. They found that every component had purpose, nothing left to chance or superstition. The gyro stabilizer assembly, small, intricate, and delicate, fascinated them most. To the Japanese, it was a revelation. A device that allowed a tank to aim while in motion defied their experience, which demanded that every gunner stop, align, breathe, then fire. In this discovery, the narration continued, they saw not only superior engineering but an alien philosophy of war, one that embraced precision through machinery, not through spirit. The engineers removed the device carefully, as if handling a relic. Captain Ishida ordered it crated and marked for transport to Rangoon to be shipped onward to Tokyo for study. But as the crate closed, Morita, still standing by the Sherman's carcass, murmured something almost inaudible, and another soldier nearby heard him whisper, "They fight with ghosts of metal." Perhaps, the narrator mused, he was not far from the truth. For in every bolt and bearing of that tank, there was the ghost of an empire that had mastered not the art of war but the science of production. Dawn broke with a pale, exhausted light that bled through the trees. The engineers had been awake for nearly 30 hours. They gathered around a field stove, eating cold rice and pickled vegetables, their faces drawn, their uniforms stained with grease and rain. Ishida reviewed his notes one last time, his pencil scratching in short, efficient strokes. He was a man of logic, but something in the night's discoveries gnawed at him, something that reason could not quiet. The voice of the documentary would soften now, describing him with empathy rather than judgment. For Captain Ishida was not a villain of history. He was a witness to its unfolding, trapped between devotion to duty and the dawning realization that his side's faith in divine victory was built on sand. He watched as two of his men tried to reattach a damaged drive sprocket for demonstration, and when the heavy component slipped and fell into the mud, cracking apart, he simply stared at it for a long moment, then turned away. That same day, the narration would say, a coded radio dispatch reached the camp. Allied forces had begun a new offensive along the railway corridor south of Myitkyina. Supplies were running low, and the engineers were ordered to prepare for immediate relocation. The order was routine, but its timing cruel. They had just begun to grasp the magnitude of what they'd found, and now they were told to move, to abandon the wreck that had become their obsession. Yet perhaps there was mercy in that. Because what they would discover next, the voice continued, dropping into a grave tone, would haunt them far more than any machinery. Beneath the commander's tent, in a crate meant for spare ammunition, an engineer named Hasegawa had found a small metal cylinder, charred, sealed, and wedged behind the driver's compartment of the Sherman. Curious, he opened it and found inside a bundle of documents, waterproofed in wax paper. They were maintenance records maps and one folded sheet that bore the title, After Action Report, Battle of Ngakiadok Pass, 1944. These papers, the narrator explained, belonged to the crew of the Sherman, records of their movements, their mechanical failures, and their brief messages home. In them lay the voices of the dead. As Hasegawa read aloud fragments of English words, haltingly translated, the camp grew silent. Engine trouble again, running hot under jungle conditions. Lost one man to sniper fire near the ridge. Hope to get mail soon. It was mundane, ordinary, human. Ishida listened and said nothing. Then came the last line, scrawled in pencil, faint but legible. We will hold this ground, no matter what comes from the trees. The engineers said nothing for a long while. In that silence, the narrator reflected, they felt something that none would ever record in their reports, a sense that the men inside this machine had not died as enemies, but as mirrors of themselves. The storm had washed most of the battlefield clean, but now and then the engineers would find small remnants, an American helmet half buried in mud, a melted canteen, a watch stopped forever at 02:16. Ishida gathered these items and ordered them placed beside the Sherman's remains. It was a quiet gesture of respect, unseen by superiors, unrecorded in any file. In the decades after the war, the narrator would say, archaeologists would uncover fragments of that same Sherman, its hull rusted through, its turret still resting where Ishida's men left it. They would find the remains of Japanese tools nearby, and among them a single American dog tag. The name on it was almost erased but legible enough to read, Corporal J. H. Lewis. The voice grew distant now, like a fading radio transmission. Perhaps it was coincidence. Or perhaps Ishida placed it there himself, a silent confession or an act of forgiveness no one would ever witness. The rain eased. The jungle, steaming in the post-storm heat, came alive with sound again, cicadas, birds, the distant hum of engines. The engineers packed up their equipment, loaded the crates onto trucks, and departed north toward Burma. Behind them, the Sherman lay dismantled, a broken monument to a war not yet decided. As they drove away, Morita looked back once. He later wrote, the narrator intoned softly, that he thought the tank looked like a sleeping animal, waiting for a war that would never wake it again. He thought the tank looked like a sleeping animal, waiting for a war that would never wake it again, and that image would follow him long after the jungle had swallowed the wreck whole, long after the war had consumed the men who dismantled it. For Private Kenji Morita, the narrator's voice resonated over the slow hum of imagined reels turning. The sight of that dead machine marked a turning point, not just in his view of the enemy, but in his understanding of what war itself had become. As their convoy rattled north through the half-flooded dirt roads of Burma, tires sinking into the mud, the engineers rode in silence. Each bump in the road sent vibrations through the crates that held the Sherman's salvaged organs, the gearbox, the gun stabilizer, the sliced pieces of armor, each tagged, measured, and labeled for shipment. Those wooden boxes, the narrator explained, were more than cargo. They were fragments of the future, artifacts of a new industrial logic that none of them could yet fully comprehend. By midday, the convoy halted near a supply depot manned by the 33rd Division. There, the engineers were met with confusion. Why, some asked, were men of the Emperor's army carrying American scrap metal through the jungle while the front burned ahead of them? But Captain Ishida brushed away the questions. He had begun to write again, long letters he would never send, addressed to his wife in Osaka. He wrote not of glory or of conquest, the narrator said quietly, but of machinery, of how even the enemy's tools seemed to possess a strange elegance, an unfeeling perfection that made him wonder whether men like him, men of flesh and faith, still had a place in the wars to come. That night, in a small clearing lit by a single oil lamp, Ishida spread his blueprints and notes. The gyro-stabilizer diagrams lay before him, their precision mocking his exhaustion. He drew comparisons to the Type 97 Kaiha, the pride of Japan's armored forces, and realized with an ache in his chest that the comparison was futile. He understood then, the narrator murmured, that his nation was fighting not a war of courage, but a war of capacity, and in that war, courage was a currency already spent. In the background, the rumble of distant artillery rolled like thunder, the earth trembling beneath it. A corporal approached, saluted, and reported that the road north was blocked. American air patrols had been sighted, and movement would have to wait until dawn. Ishida nodded absently. He was staring at one of the Sherman's internal components, a burned-out radio transceiver. It was compact, efficient, and unlike anything he'd ever seen built in a Japanese factory. What unsettled him most, the voice continued, was not how advanced it was, but how impersonal. It was a device built by men who never saw the front, never touched the mud or the blood, yet their creation spoke across miles, guiding others to kill with precision. As he turned the radio over in his hands, water dripping from the tent roof above, Ishida whispered, "They fight as if their machines carry their souls." Outside, Morita was keeping watch, his rifle resting across his knees, the jungle whispering with the sound of night insects. He thought of the Americans who had crewed that tank, their names unknown, their faces blurred by the smoke of memory, and wondered if any of them had looked at a Japanese soldier and thought the same thing, that their enemies were not men, but extensions of a vast, faceless machine. In wars of industry, the narrator said, his tone carrying both melancholy and clarity, the line between man and mechanism blurs until both become instruments of a larger design. The next morning, the engineers resumed their journey. The road wound north through mist and shattered trees, evidence of recent bombardments. Along the way, They pass villages reduced to ashes, oxen carcasses bloated in the heat, and the remnants of Japanese supply convoys struck by American fighter bombers. To those who survived in that theater, the narration reflected, the war was not a series of battles but an unending erosion, a slow grind against time, hunger, and the elements. When they reached Burma, they found a staging area crowded with wounded men and shattered vehicles. Yet among the chaos, Ishida secured a small warehouse for his findings. He and his team spent 2 days cataloging every component from the Sherman, creating a manual that would never reach Tokyo. Those pages, later found in a rotting chest after the war, contained a rare mixture of awe and despair, the voiceover explained. They did not praise the enemy, they simply documented what perfection looked like when molded into steel. In one margin, Ishida had written a single line, "The Americans build as though death itself were just another assembly line." The narration lingered on that image, its rhythm slow, almost mournful. It was perhaps the most honest assessment ever penned by a man who still believed outwardly in victory. Meanwhile, the engineers unit was reassigned to assist with bridge construction along the Irrawaddy, but Ishida could not let go of his obsession. Each night, he revisited the crates, studying the wiring diagrams by candlelight. Morita often stood nearby, silent, watching his commander's face in the flickering glow. He had begun to see in Ishida the look of a man haunted not by defeat but by knowledge, the narrator said. Knowledge that the enemy's power was not born of divine favor but of human ingenuity harnessed by unthinkable scale. One evening, as rain battered the tin roof of their makeshift camp, Ishida finally spoke to Morita. "Do you think they fear us?" he asked. Morita hesitated before answering. "They fight because they must, like us." Ishida smiled faintly. "No, they fight because they can." The words carried the weight of prophecy, and though neither man realized it, the truth of them would echo far beyond Burma. For every Sherman dismantled in the jungle, the voiceover concluded, 10 more rolled from American factories. For every Japanese soldier who fought with conviction, the empire had fewer machines, fewer hands to build them, fewer resources to keep pace. The scene would dissolve in the viewer's mind to montage. Rows of assembly lines in Detroit, tanks moving on conveyor belts under the glare of electric light, workers in overalls tightening bolts with practiced rhythm, all intercut with the rain-soaked faces of Ishida's men staring at their crated fragments in the jungle gloom. In that contrast lay the essence of the modern war. The narrator's tone deepened, resonant and cold. One fought with spirit, the other with steel, and in the end, steel endured. Weeks turned to months, and the jungle claimed everything it touched. The machines, the men, the ambitions of nations. The engineers who had once stood in awe of the captured Sherman were soon dispersed across Burma's collapsing front, each swallowed by the grinding retreat that marked the slow death of the Imperial Army's reach. By late 1944, the narrator's voice returned, subdued and grave. The Japanese position in Burma had begun to disintegrate under the weight of Allied advance. What remained of Ishida's engineering detachment became ghosts on a road that no longer led home. Morita, the young soldier who had once stood transfixed before the disassembled tank, was reassigned to an infantry company defending the rail junction at Lashio. Ishida never saw him again. In the chaos of retreat, the voice continued, records disappear, names vanish. But some things persist, rumors, fragments, memories carried on by those who survived long enough to remember. One such fragment came from a British officer's diary written after the liberation of northern Burma. In it, he described finding a Japanese technical site hidden in the jungle, wooden crates filled with tank components, diagrams carefully preserved, and a single page nailed to the wall of a bamboo hut. Written in careful English, it read, "To understand the enemy is to see oneself clearly. We did not lose to men. We lost to what they made." That note, the narrator intoned, was unsigned, but historians believe it was the final message of Captain Ishida. Whether he died during the retreat or perished in an air raid remains unknown. What is known is that the documents he and his men prepared never reached Japan. The crates were recovered by Allied forces and sent, ironically, to American ordnance divisions for study. The circle had closed. the voice said quietly. The machine that once belonged to America had revealed its secrets to Japan, only to be captured again, its parts making one last journey across the ocean, back to the hands that had created it. The narration lingered as if over-fatting film footage, rusted steel glinting beneath vines, insects crawling over what had once been a turret ring, rainwater filling the hollow where men once worked with reverence and dread. Nature has no memory for war, the voice reflected, only the slow patience to reclaim what men build and destroy. Decades later, in 1972, a Burmese farmer clearing land near Myitkyina uncovered a corroded steel plate buried beneath the roots of a banyan tree. It bore the faint outline of a star. That fragment, the narrator explained, was all that remained of Able 6, the Sherman tank that had once stood as a symbol of power, then as an object of revelation, and finally as dust. The documentary tone softened, almost tender now. In the end, what Ishida and his men saw within that machine was not simply superior technology. It was the embodiment of a truth that every soldier in every age must face, that the future belongs not to the brave alone, but to those who build what endures. Images, imagined or real, would flicker now. Factory workers in Detroit smiling for cameras, Japanese engineers scribbling notes by candlelight, Morita staring into the jungle rain. For a moment in time, the voice continued, two worlds collided in that Burmese clearing, one forged by faith, the other by industry. Both believed themselves righteous. Both sent their sons into steel coffins to prove it. Silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of wind across forgotten battlefields. War, the narrator concluded, is not only fought with weapons. It is fought with the belief that our creations reflect who we are. And when the smoke clears, what remains, whether a rusted tank or a line in a forgotten report, is not victory but understanding. The final shot would linger on the jungle, timeless and indifferent, as dawn light seeped through the mist. Here, the voice said in its last breath, in this place where machines once roared and men once believed they could shape the world, there is only silence, the kind that follows revelation.